Hi, my name's Alice, I'm a French YouTuber, and a couple of months ago I started posting about the French protest on social media. As the protest continued, I made a video about it on my YouTube channel, and that's when I noticed a common theme in my comment section. Some people said the French will protest for anything, or why can't something like this happen in America? Now, I couldn't help but feel the powerlessness in those comments. And the same sentiments were reflected in American media coverage. The accepted narrative seemed to be that the types of protests taking place in France could never happen in America because French people and French culture were just different.
The French love to protest.
The culture of protest runs deep.
Striking and protesting was the French national pastime.
French retirees are outraged that the retirement age is going to go up from just 62 years old to 64.
They really do love their strikes.
The fact of the matter is Americans don't like the fact that they're retiring later, but they're not, at this particular point, going out on the streets and causing a lot of trouble.
This really bothered me. Why do we see protesting, striking, unionizing as something essentially cultural? Whose interest does it serve to promote this narrative? And finally, like my commenters said, could something like this,
more than 1 million striking against the president's proposed pension reform,
happen in America? We're going to get to the bottom of those questions right now. This is the Classroom from More Perfect Union, and today we're talking about Europe. Now, before we get to the nitty-gritty of it, I'd like to go and see why some fellow French citizens decided to show up to the protest today.
Non, non, non à ta réforme bidon.
Parce qu'on est contre la réforme injuste et ignoble de M. Macron et qu'on ne veut pas que ça passe. Il fait du déni de démocratie. Il est en train de mettre une pagaille en France comme c'est pas permis parce que tout est à l'arrêt.
Moi, je suis le mouvement des manifestations contre la réforme des retraites depuis le début.
Ouais.
Et j'avais vraiment envie de venir à celle-ci en particulier parce que la loi a été passée.
Ouais.
Pas votée, mais passée.
Ils sont profondément opposés à cette réforme. Parce que d'autres solutions existent et je pense que s'ils faisaient l'effort d'écouter et les syndicalistes et les parlementaires...
Mais ce dialogue, il peut marcher que s'il y a une base de droit quand même.
il faut
c'est là où
rester
ça...
du droit, nous on est les garants.
C'est là, voilà, on parle de dialogue, mais si les travailleurs n'ont plus de droit, c'est compliqué d'avoir un dialogue.
Et on sait que tous une place dans la société. Et je pense que voilà, il faut se battre là-dessus. Il faut essayer de faire avancer les droits pour tout le monde. Tout le monde se sentira mieux.
Okay, back to the studio. So the first thing I did was to take a little bit of distance and look at where we come from. To make things simple, we can divide the last century in 3 eras. First, the era of decline of Union prosperity after the Second World War that progressed into the 1980s into an era of rapid deunionization in exchange for increasing management power. And finally, a third, potentially new era that we'll talk about later in the video. And to make things even simpler, we're going to create 2 tracks that will materialize Europe on the one hand and America on the other hand. That way we'll be able to check the progress made on each side as we move forward. But first, let's start with the beginning. We're in the late 1890s and unemployment is really high in the US. Between 3,000 to 4,000 unemployed workers gather in Union Square in New York to listen to one woman called Emma Goldman, an anarchist and a ferocious workers' rights advocate. Goldman told them the following, quote, "Demonstrate before the palaces of the rich. Demand work. If they do not give you work, demand bread. If they deny you birth, take bread." 20 years before that, you could hear similar speeches in France as the Paris Commune sought to establish itself against the bourgeois republic. Revolution was in the air both in Europe and in the US. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to quell industrial unrest and introduce collective bargaining between trade unions and employers. That's a serious step forward for America. Now, a year later, the left-wing coalition called Le Front Populaire, the Popular Front, won the French elections with a pro-workers' rights agenda. They established a 40-hour work week and forced employers to raise wages and to give employees 2 weeks of paid holidays. 10 years later, the right to strike was even put in the French constitution. Europe catches up. At that time, it felt like a dialogue between employers and employees could exist because things were done to reduce the inequality of bargaining power between the 2 groups. But that didn't last long. As globalization and deindustrialization accelerated, union prosperity declined. In 2 decades, the US Parliament and several states established laws meant to make striking increasingly illegal. In response to major post-war strikes, Republicans and Democrats passed the Taft-Hartley Act, also called the Labor Management Relations Act, in 1947. the act restricted the activities and power of labor unions by first making secondary strikes illegal. It meant that union workers could no longer support a strike initiated by workers in another corporation. Strikes could only be organized against the contractual employers. Now, these restrictions also exist in some European countries like Latvia, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK, and they can be applied in Germany, Italy, and Spain, depending on the nature of the strike. In France, on the other hand, secondary strikes are legal and solidarity action is common. The Taft-Hartley Act also allowed individual states, later called right-to-work states, to outlaw the union shop and agency shop arrangements in companies. These arrangements forced newly hired employees to either join the company's union or at least pay union contributions, so getting rid of them helped decrease union membership. Finally, 20 years later, the controversial Public Employees' Fair Employment Act of 1967, better known as the Taylor Law, prohibited New York State employees from striking. All these new obstacles forced America to put the brakes on union development. Before we look at what happened in Europe, did you notice how the meaning of words have changed there? First, we have a law titled Public Employees' Fair Employment Act that made striking illegal and led to the incarceration of public workers. Then you have the right-to-work states outlawing compulsory union membership, therefore implying that unions prevent employees from working. And finally, remember that the Labor Relations Act of the 1930s was amended by the Labor Management Relations Act. Words matter, and those examples show that the culture around work changed in favor of management. It was the beginning of a new era, the era of management power. So, what happened during that time in Europe? Well, Europe tried to resist the rise of free market capitalism. Eastern Europe was under the influence or part of the communist USSR, and Western Europe tended to reject US imperialism. For example, in May 1968, an unprecedented wave of protest as well as a general strike took over France, and was then followed by the Italian Autunno Caldo, meaning hot autumn, during which Italian workers went on a series of strikes to demand better working conditions. Those two moments of resistance marked the history of labor in Europe. The goal was to ensure that economic shocks weren't instrumentalized to encourage the privatization of the economy or increase employers' power over employees. Let me give you an example. As unemployment rose in France in the 1970s, unions advocated for a policy of work sharing, which meant that employees' working hours would be reduced to encourage employers to hire new workers. Their motto was very simple: work less, work all. Unsurprisingly, it is around that time that Americans started working more than Europeans. Before that, it was the opposite. Americans worked less than Europeans. So it's not so much about cultural differences, but rather about unions' resistance and achievements in times of economic shock. After the shock, those achievements were often secured and became the new norm. However, while most of Europe was resisting the influence of the US, one European leader chose to open the door to neoliberalism.
The Iron Lady of the Western world.
In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected as the UK Prime Minister. In the US, the neoliberal ideology was already well established and culminated with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it.
Thatcher and Reagan were aggressively anti-union. They did not hide it. As soon as she was elected, Thatcher dismantled trade unions with a series of employment acts that made picketing increasingly illegal. Unsurprisingly, UK's percentage of trade union membership significantly decreased, despite being one of the strongest in Europe in the decades that came before that. On the other side of the Atlantic, Reagan chose a more spectacular approach to change his country's sentiments towards unions. On August 3, 1981, Reagan stepped onto a podium in the White House Rose Garden with a grey suit and perfectly combed hair to make an important statement.
I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
I want to pause on this particular event known as the 1981 PATCO strike, because it is a defining moment in labor history. It confirmed the fact that we had entered a new era, the era of management. So the PATCO strike didn't go as planned. Air traffic controllers asked for a significant raise and went on strike to force negotiations. They thought they had the upper hand because an airport couldn't properly run without air traffic controllers to ensure planes land safely. But Reagan's administration also had a plan. After his announcement, the president and his team looked for replacement workers to counter the strike. Luckily for them, the sky was blue on the following day, the visibility was great, and pilots didn't need controllers' help much. The traffic was up to 75% of normal, and the strikers were fired the following day. The PATCO strike became an example to learn from. The Wharton School of Business even came out with their own manual to encourage business leaders to use the failed strike as a source of inspiration. Ronald Reagan was seen as a hero who had resisted evil, lazy strikers and helped things go back to normal for regular Americans. As Kenny Mallern, the host of NPR's Planet Money podcast, explained in an episode, Reagan was able to convince a good chunk of the American public that strike breaking, not striking, was something patriotic.
They're not going out on the streets and causing a lot of trouble.
Because we're working too hard to go out and
That's right. No croissants for us.
It resonated with the experience of people living in an increasingly individualistic society, meaning a society where individual freedoms are prioritized over everything else. In that society, strikers are said to infringe on regular workers' freedom to move. I wish I could say that France escaped the neoliberal wave, but I'd be lying to you. It is true that when Thatcher and Reagan came to power, French voters elected left-wing candidate François Mitterrand, who kicked off his mandate with a Keynesian agenda. But it didn't work the way he wanted, and so he ended up aligning himself with the US and the UK. So yeah, time for Europe to also put the brakes on. The 2008 subprime mortgage crisis accelerated this process. It hit the most vulnerable countries like Greece and allowed Europe to impose austerity measures meant to further dismantle their welfare system. So, after decades of neoliberal policies, the way we work and protest has completely changed. Trade union density has seriously decreased all over the world. In 2017, the number of workers who went on strike in the UK fell to its lowest level since the late 19th century. France has roughly the same percentage of union membership as the US, around 10%. I know, it always surprises people when I say that, given the image we have of French citizens, French workers. But as we mentioned earlier, and contrary to Americans, French citizens are allowed to join secondary strikes, which in turn favors sectoral bargaining. It means that the government can apply victories achieved in one company or one sector of an industry to an entire sector or an entire industry, and to all workers, even those who aren't members of a union. This solidarity among employees is the reason why French Amazon workers got their employers to close French warehouses for 5 days at the beginning of the pandemic to make sure safety measures were in place. In the meantime, in the US, ALU leader-to-be Chris Moll was fired for staging a walkout to protest those same unsafe working conditions. In France and in other European countries, union leaders are political actors who have access to government officials, and the government is supposed to listen to them. That is why they are more likely to organize big protests close to powerful institutions that any individual can join. In other words, unions are meant to embody a form of counterpower from the local to the national level. Now, I say they are supposed, they are meant, because it is clearly not happening in France at the moment, and that's why people keep protesting. For the past decades, up to this very day, we have witnessed the rapid dismantlement of workers' past victories, and can't even voice our anger through unions because the government refuses to listen to them. We get told that we're lazy, that we need to tighten the belt, while French billionaire Bernard Arnault became the richest man on earth. What? Elon reached the title? Well, it doesn't matter, because we have the richest women on earth. Look at us, bridging the gender pay gap, one female billionaire at a time. So our initial question was, could something like the protest in France happen in the US? And for me the answer to that question is that it won't happen overnight, but it is possible. In fact, unions are regaining momentum in the US. Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, said that the US are entering a new era in its labor history, one in which workers are primed to transition into a more confrontational relationship with management. You should take to heart that many of the French citizens I spoke to are inspired by America, that's right. Protests organized by BLM and Me Too movements, progressive leaders like Bernie Sanders and AOC have struck a chord with the youth in France. They have politicized young people across the globe and encouraged them to go in the streets and demand what is right. It is clear that our countries have a deep relationship of inspiring each other, going back to the days of revolution. And if you're watching the images of protest here in Europe, even though your laws may be more restrictive, there is no reason that you can't join this movement seeking to restore union power. So organize your workplace, spread the message on social media, let's keep inspiring each other. It's only the beginning.
Thank you for joining us in The Classroom, a series by More Perfect Union. We're taking on right-wing propaganda and telling the stories that corporate-backed media ignores, while seeking out solutions for a better future for all Americans. So join us, like and subscribe.